So what I will be discussing today is the basis of the subject for my PhD. Because I had to halt it, I was really only in the preliminary stages of research. So a lot of what I will be saying will be coming from the ideas that built up that led to me applying for the PhD rather than the actual progress of it. So the title of my talk is about exploring neocolonialism and the colonial gains in British children's literature after 1990. And the reason I chose that particular period following 1990 is because I think we got into all sorts of professionals in publishing, teaching, and librarianship. We got into quite some comfortable position thinking that we made so many moves in presenting better images of people of colour that perhaps not so much needed to be done, but there were still a few holes that needed to be sort of filled up with better knowledge. And also my primary focus is on Africa, and so my PhD looks at representation of Africa and Africans. And that includes the diaspora as well. So what I'll be talking about is my experiential origins. So my interest in the subject really stems from my first professional post as a children's librarian, which was in the year 2000. And I found that books published, particularly novels of fiction set in Africa, and also non-fiction actually, did show Africa as in that very old way of, the dark continent. Books of fiction tended to be about struggling Africans, and there's certain vocabulary around writing about Africa that was very common. And what I want to use, two essays, I don't know if I can call them essays, one of them is a TED talk, and one is an essay, which really illustrates the background to the subject. So if I go to the first discussion, The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which was a TED talk she gave in 2009. It's freely available on YouTube. I urge you to go and watch it. There are some parts that will make you want to cry, but there are also parts that make you want to laugh as well, which is true of the other essay. This quote really stood out to me. This is an anecdote that begins with her moving to America to study, and she's talking to her roommate, who asks whether she can listen to some of her tribal music. And her response to that is to pull out a cassette of Mariah Carey's greatest hits, which is the only music that she has on her. So she listens to what her roommate understands that Africa is about, and comes up with this statement that her roommate's idea of Africa is a single story catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. And this was quite a culture shock, particularly as Chimamanda comes from a quite well-off, middle-class, educated family in Nigeria, and grew up on a university campus, so doesn't really know anything outside of a middle-class educational environment. So it's quite a culture shock for her to move to America, and then discover that her primary their understanding of her identity is primarily that she's black rather than anything else. So the next piece of writing that I interacted with was How to Write About Africa by Kenyan writer Binyavanga Wainaina, who's sadly no longer with us. And this essay is hugely entertaining. It's satirical, but it's also incredibly funny. And I've read it dozens and dozens of times, and it still makes me laugh all the way through. So this is the standout comment for me. Do not put a well-adjusted African on the cover or in it, unless that African has won a Nobel Prize. an AK-47, prominent ribs, naked breasts, use these. This really illustrates what I was finding when I worked as the children's librarian in the books, and the AK-47 is coming up later. And at the end, what his final sentence is, at the end you should use a quote from Nelson Mandela about, I don't know, clouds and sunshine or something like that. So, yes, it really is a terrific read, and again, freely available online. So the background for my kind of the theory that I want to use, I'm very fortunate that I can use entirely kind of black philosophers and literary theorists, and some of them more well known than others. So at the bottom left we have Frantz Fanon, very frequently used in discussions of post-colonial theory, applied to philosophy, politics and literature, so he's quite multidisciplinary. Top right is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's the only one of these gentlemen who is still alive. Bottom right, Kwame Nkrumah, who is actually credited, I don't know if you know, with actually coining the term neocolonialism. His book was published in 1965, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, where he sets out ideas that really kind of foreshadow what was coming in the way that the West would interact with Africa and other continents and former colonial countries, and the interests that were starting to be expressed towards countries once they became independent, and how a lot of economic interests were more for the benefit of the West than for the African countries themselves. And considering it was published in 1965, I think that there's a lot of kind of foreshadowing in his writing. So, but I'm going to talk about both bad and good representation, and I will begin with bad representation. So, the kind of images, and I'll be talking about illustrated images as well as the written word, they kind of go back to really kind of pre-20th century fiction, you know, the noble savage and the warrior, various antagonists that go against the hero. So you get this, you know, W.E. Johns and writers of that ilk. More recently, you have families that live on subsistence farming. That's if they're eating at all, if they're not starving. And very often orphan children, almost exclusively you have orphan children. So there are often neocolonial undertones. And just to clarify neocolonialism, it's a term that's mostly used in the field of political economy to refer to, as Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his book, after post-independence, the economic interests from outside of Africa and how Africa was exploited to benefit Western countries rather than actually sort of building it up for its own benefit. So also what we unfortunately have in a lot of children's books is limited settings, plot storylines, themes and tropes. So in terms of limited settings, very frequently we have rural settings. So really my purpose in originally looking through these books and thinking about and contemplating what they were saying was, what are we communicating to children about Africa? Again, back to the danger of a single story. It's this single story of tragedy, catastrophe and disaster. And so we look upon African people and the continent itself with pity. And the village settings suggests that countries haven't moved on. There's, you know, no technology. The construction of housings and dwellings is stuck in the Stone Age, even though it might be a practical way of building. There isn't really the context given of how, what thought has gone into the way that people live, but also that it's limited to kind of this agrarian lifestyle, and that Africa has not moved on in the way that the rest of the world has and embraced technology. Stories are often based around famine and other natural and unnatural disasters. At the bottom you see the unnatural disasters often based around corrupt governments and civil wars. And something that particularly irks me is the wild animals close to human habitats. Sometimes it seems fairly plausible, more often not. I particularly remember a wonderful conversation with my mother, who emigrated here from Kenya in 1963, in her early 20s, from herself in Kenya. And I was having a discussion about my plans to pursue the PhD, and she said to me, "You know, Phyllis, the first time I ever saw a lion was in London Zoo," which I thought was absolutely wonderful, which I think perhaps I'll put that quote at the beginning when I finally completely publish. There are a couple of really interesting reports that I've looked at. One from CLPE, Reflecting Realities, which came out in, can someone help me, it was 2021, Reflecting Realities, about diversity, ethnic diversity in publishing. And there's also this report, The Writing the Future, by Spread the Word, which found that Black and Asian authors felt that they were steered into reproducing ethnic and racial stereotypes, whether in their stories or in the way their books were packaged and promoted, which is very interesting because when I started reading about post-colonialism, particularly post-colonial writers, like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who appeared before, and other post-colonial writers from Asia and Africa, when they were finally beginning to be published, they did feel a pressure to write their own stories and about themselves in rather, slightly demeaning ways, and writing themselves as subjugated and as of lower status, because shortly after independence, perhaps they still felt that way, as there was still a European presence in their countries. But I think it's quite startling that Black and Asian authors still feel that way. I should point out, actually, as a disclaimer, that most of the titles that I did gather were actually from the late 90s and the early 2000s. And I'm pleased to say that I did find it more and more difficult to find books published much later into the 2000s, which is at least a positive development. So these, as a children's librarian, this is what the kind of book covers that I was coming across. Largely non-fiction books with titles like Growing Up in an African Village and A Day in the Life of an African Village. Had a surprise, I know a book that's delightful to everyone, delightful also to me. I've shared that with my own children. It's perfectly acceptable as a children's book. I remember my supervisor said to me, "Yes, Phyllis, but why is this probably the primary image that children have of Africa? This is the African book that you share with primary school children, not one that is perhaps based in a city, one of which I will show you later." So this is what a book that is on the kind of not quite the worst, but on the poor end of representation. Little Soldier by Bernard Ashley. Yes, a very common feature is that stories are set in fictional African countries. Now, all sorts of stories are set in fictional places, towns and so on, and for various reasons. I'm sure a lot of authors are advised by their legal department that perhaps, if you're going to write this book that completely is derogatory about this place where you grew up, perhaps give it a fictional name. It's very common to do that. Black Swan Green, that's the book I was thinking of by David Mitchell. I mean, that was a kind of fictionalised account of his adolescence. So we have a fictional African country. Oh, but it actually has a name. Often the country does not have a name. We have child soldiers in this book. Here we have the AK-47 reference on the cover. We have fetishisation and objectification. So children are often referred to by their physical attributes. The curliness of the hair, the size of the lips, the thickness of the body, the shininess of the skin, in very much the same way that feminists often highlight the objectification of women, of the male gaze, and how women are often described physically rather than their personal attributes. We have the white saviour complex in this book as well, with Kalinda, the protagonist, being saved from being a child soldier by a white family and brought to live in South London. Something I wanted to highlight is that this book, I have a book too, this came out on Wednesday, and I do go into some detail about Kalinda's experience with his white family. So I co-wrote an essay in this book that came out on Wednesday, published by Routledge, Family and Children's and Young Adult Literature. I discuss a lot of what I'm talking about here. For more detail about objectification and in black images, this is a very good resource, White on Black, published in 1990, but still really, really useful because there's a lot of historical data with early reports of explorers in Africa describing what people look like, using quite pejorative terms, and some old illustrations. It talks about advertising, television, all sorts of things, covers of rice boxes and pancakes and all the usual things that you would expect. So now we're getting to the slightly worse, the little soldier area. Yes, sadly, Michael Morpurgo is in there, Dear Ollie. Dear Ollie is actually the book that actually started this whole journey. It was shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal, as are all the books I've mentioned here. So I read it and was really quite appalled. The premises of the novel is that 8-year-old Ollie's 18-year-old brother Matt has abandoned his medical degree to go and help out in a refugee camp in an unnamed African country. And he writes letters back to Ollie, talking about how he's so brilliant and he's just saving the day. And I don't think that the writer has seen the irony in the brother's medical degree actually being incredibly useful in a refugee camp, and his marvellous skills as an entertainer and a clown not necessarily being that useful. However, his entertainment skills are sufficient. He is completely and utterly lauded and writes and tells his sister how wonderful he is. So again, we have the white saviour. Another feature is that children are often uneducated in fiction about Africa. They don't go to school. Now, this is exclusive to all fiction, but they often receive, at best, a very sort of rudimentary education at home, as in The Child's Elephant. And then we have the orphans again. And there's usually a lot of ambiguity about how children have lost their parents, but it's often hinted that it's some kind of communicable disease or starvation. They don't die by the way that we would in old age or being run over by a bus. It's always something that we expect Africans to die from. So I have separated the bottom issues, which all appear in The Child's Elephant. which is one of the too many problems as far as I'm concerned. I often refer to the child's elephant as the kitchen sink of tragedy, because it's got just everything. For those that don't understand the English idiom, the kitchen sink is when something is overfilled with things, often suitcases when you're going on holiday. You've got everything in there but the kitchen sink. So we have child trafficking, child soldiers, famine, we have animism, we have a witch doctor. And considering that that book was published in 2013, I think that's quite a bold move to put a witch doctor in there in this day and age. We also have condescending folk wisdom. And by that, I mean there's almost always an elderly person, usually a grandmother, who dispenses wisdom, but it's done in such a condescending way that you just sort of tilt your head and you're thinking, the way that you would when a 3-year-old comes out with something wise or funny. And we have 3 people dispensing folk wisdom here. We have the local fisherman, we have the main character's grandmother, and we also have the head of a pygmy tribe. We also have a pygmy tribe in this book, which is why I've used the phrase the exotic spectacle of indigeneity. And we have all manner of, quite unpleasant images of this pygmy tribe living in the jungle. And again, the proximity to wild animals in this book, really absolutely the kitchen sink of that's not all tragic, but we've just got everything, every image that you could, or every stereotype you could possibly have about Africa in this book. It's my least favourite of all the books I'm looking at. So what is good representation? Well, we could start with more diversity in storylines and genres. I'd like to see more black characters in science fiction and fantasy. And by that, I mean science fiction and fantasy written by British authors, because the Americans are really streets ahead in these areas. Animal stories other than those in wild animals. In my first year of Carnegie judging, there were quite a few novels with stories about children nurturing animals and having really good relationships with animals that were injured or had some sort of problem. And it was usually a coping mechanism for some kind of tragedy in their lives. There were children whose parents had died or whose parents had divorced. And the nurturing of the animal is used as a kind of theme of the child developing. Their kind of builder's romance is that they are helping these animals, and they discover things about themselves through nurturing these animals. And they usually birds and dogs and cats and so on. It would be nice to see more black children or African children doing those kinds of things. And humour, where is the humour? Stories based in Africa where we could just laugh at. Somebody going to school and a bus starts talking to him. Anything like that. I'm struggling to find that kind of writing, particularly from the beginning of the period that I'm looking at, so the 1990s and early 2000s. Also, draw upon characters from the professional classes, by which I mean the parents. And this goes back to subsistence farming. I have an anecdote from a friend that I cannot substantiate, so I can't share it with you, but I did hear something about a writer being, not a well-known writer, being asked to change a parent in a novel set in South Africa from a lawyer to a farmer, because it would seem unrealistic for a black person to be a lawyer, which was a bit equal, but I can't substantiate that, unfortunately. And varying the settings as well, again, moving away from the rural settings. Let's have other planets, universes, again, going back to sci-fi and fantasy. Cities, please. Educational institutions like boarding school, why not? And show positive interactions with technology as well. I checked this statistic the other day, almost 85% mobile phone coverage across Africa. It's used for many, many things. I mean, people run businesses through phones, they receive money from relatives overseas and so on. So African countries have really, really embraced mobile phone technology and other technologies too. It's interesting, my family back in Kenya, they live in quite a remote village, not that far from Mount Kenya, and they have no running water and no electricity, and never have had, even since all the years ago I visited, but they all have mobile phones. And there are charging stations at the local schools, and so they're all on Facebook and everything. So really embrace that. It would be good to see more of that in books. So, two examples of good representation. Now, I was talking about tragedy, catastrophe, and so on. Now, both of these books do focus on tragic events. However, it's how the tragedy is told. So, my first praise of these novels, they are authentic representations of Africa by former inhabitants. Beverly, hello Beverly, from South Africa. Jason Wallace grew up in Zimbabwe, and his book Out of Shadows is set in Zimbabwe in 1983, so it's 3 years after independence. So, as I said, the tragedy is told with sufficient empathy. And another important thing I think about writing about Africa is about doing research. I mean, if you're someone who hasn't lived in the country, it's important that you do research, which is why I think this idea of the unnamed African country means you can just generalise, you can absolutely, be completely and utterly free with what you say about Africa in inverted commas, because it's you haven't named a specific country. I suppose you wouldn't be susceptible to cancelling or any kind of critique. And I think it's quite frankly just lazy. Also, in both of these books, the harsh realities of racism are addressed correctly. And I speak as someone who's experienced that kind of treatment. In Out of Shadows, it's quite interesting that one of the white characters, his father runs a farm, and he kind of encourages rivalry between the two tribes that he employs. He favours one over the other. I can't remember which way round it is. It's the Shona and the Matabele tribes. He prefers to employ one because he says that the other ones are drunken and lazy and so on and so forth. So he creates this rivalry, which I find to be completely plausible and credible. I myself come from the Kikuyu tribe, and apparently we're crooked. And most importantly, characters are given agency. Sade is incredible in that she kind of picks herself up and decides what to do, walking through the streets of London, having been abandoned. And even once they enter into the care of the social services and foster care, she is still proactive in trying to find her father. And it's not a common thing for children in African fiction of that period, fiction about Africa of that period. Everyone's waiting to be saved. Again, the white saviour narrative. People are constantly waiting to be saved rather than being active in their own futures and fortunes. So this is what I'd like to see more of. And going on to books for younger children, picture books, other good representation. The Anna Hibiscus series by the Nigerian author Atinuke. It's set in Lagos, so we have a city setting. We have two parents of the family. We also have an extended family. They live together with grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and so on. It's quite a large compound. The family seems to be quite wealthy. Nikki Daly, the two Jamila books, Not So Fast Songololo. They're wonderful books, also set in South African towns and cities, wonderfully illustrated. And again, Jamila's dress really took me by surprise because, again, going back to the issue of technology, there was a sewing machine, a car, and a camera, which I thought was quite enlightening, a quite new experience for me to see so much technology in the book about Africa. Another positive thing is we have healthy relationships among stable families here. We don't have the tragic, dysfunctional family as I've experienced before. And a book that I've dipped into is The Sociology of African Family by Diane Kayangomale and Phyllis Ramage, which is a very good look. It has, the downside of it is it's about Africa, so it talks, there are generalizations. They do tend to focus on their own cultures. They're both, one's, well, I'm not going to say where they're from because I can't remember. It has a tendency to generalise the African experience, but it does mention issues such as extended family and how highly children are valued, which comes across in all of these books. And also we have various social classes in these books. Anna Hibiscus obviously comes from a middle class family. The characters in Nikki Daly's books are from aspirational working class families. We have internal conflicts resolved, not disaster after disaster after disaster. Okay, that's fine. So what needs to change? And where are we now? So here are some examples of fantasy novels featuring black characters. They're all published in the USA. I think we really need to pull our socks up and get some decent fantasy novels with black characters over here. And then there is African futurism, which, as someone who is not a fan of either science fiction or fantasy, I'm still excited about this genre. It's been around for quite a few years, but again, the writers of all of these books and all of these named authors are all from the USA. So again, I think we really need to move along with this. So I have a bibliography here. So I have a list of books here that I'm sure we can share with you. And I'd like to thank you for listening.